So I'm going to be talking about having a say in care, and that was the title that was suggested to me. I added the bit about careful deliberation, and I'll hopefully convince you why we need to think about careful deliberation as well as having a say of care. And what I'm going to be saying is based on a variety of experiences over getting on for 20 years now of different contexts in which older people have been involved in some ways in seeking to influence public policy and service delivery. And I've been involved in those different initiatives in a variety of roles. I've been a researcher, researching that sort of thing. I've been a consultant, advising people about how to do it, including with colleagues at NUI in Galway. I've actually been a participant. I was co-opted to take part in an older people's council, and I'm currently working as a co-worker with older people, and I'll tell you a bit more about that later. In fact, the pictures that illustrate aspects of my slide illustrate some of the people that we're currently working with, and as I say, I'll tell you a bit more about that. Okay. Within the UK, and indeed in other parts of the world, there are now a huge range of different types of ways in which older people can get involved, can have their voices heard. They're all spaces in which older people can and do have their say about policy in relation to care, in relation to the resourcing of care, in terms of the practice of service delivery, reflecting on the experiences, what it's like to be on the receiving end, and indeed on the principles on which care services ought to be provided. But they're also spaces in which people demonstrate their care for other sorts of issues. And whilst the focus of today is on participation in the context of care, I think it's really important that we don't actually separate that out and say that that is disconnected from some of the things that you were talking about yesterday. So in locality-based older people's forums, in forums that have been constituted by local government and by health services to consult with older people, through the National Pensioners Convention, campaigning around pensions and health service, in initiatives focused around particular services, and indeed in participatory research projects, older people are being involved in a way that is perhaps different from the way in which they've been involved before. And in those different contexts, you can see older people having different identities. They are recognised as citizens to whom public services are accountable, as political actors who are helping to shape public policy, as community members who have commitments to places and people, as knowledgeable experts on the experience of ageing, as well as recipients of health and welfare interventions, and also as co-producers and colleagues in generating knowledge. So I think we're talking about a very wide-ranging set of activities with different principles and which view older people in different ways. Now then, deliberation. These opportunities for older people to have their say about policies, about service delivery, is part of a broader movement towards more participatory decision-making across the public sector and indeed beyond. And many of those who have promoted these new participatory opportunities, whereby citizens in different contexts can become involved in policy making, draw on ideas of deliberative democracy. And deliberative democracy is a development in thinking about democracy which says we should be thinking about not just people electing representatives to speak on their behalf and to recall those representatives if they don't like what they're saying, but we actually need to create opportunities for people to come together and deliberate, to discuss issues of public policy, of public import. And this quote is one illustration of what is being argued for here, that deliberative democracy requires spaces where rational debate amongst equals can happen, where citizens, politicians and experts can meet without one group dominating another, where all have equal opportunity to pursue their arguments and to challenge others, and where the intentions of all are focused on achieving the best possible outcomes rather than pursuing self-interest. Now then, I was teaching some postgraduate students the other week about deliberative democracy, and I put that quote up and said, okay, well let's just look at that, let's discuss that. And very quickly, my students suggested that there were indeed a number of problems in that statement of what is now being referred to as the deliberative ideal. Creating spaces where debate about public policy issues and about service delivery can happen doesn't necessarily mean that people actually feel able to take part in those spaces, or indeed that when they do, their contribution has been valued. And critics of this idea of deliberative democracy, critics who are nevertheless really sympathetic to the notion that we should find ways of enabling citizens to play a bigger part in making public policy, they point to a number of different difficulties. First of all, the impossibility of creating a level playing field. The idea that simply by bringing together people from different classes, different ages, different educational level, different life experiences, simply bringing them together in a room and saying, okay, you're all equal, let's debate these issues, actually doesn't mean that people feel equal or are treated equally. And the second major critique is that this emphasis on rational debate, the sort of debate that public officials feel comfortable with when they get round a table round the board table in an executive suite, for example, that sort of rational debate about policy issues actually may exclude people whose styles of speaking and whose styles of exchange are different from that. And one called Prof Marian Barnes, an American a political philosopher who was talking about this sort of thing, actually said, well as rational debate, we need to recognise the importance of different styles of communication. We need to recognise the importance of greeting. And by greeting, she meant those sorts of exchanges which are designed to recognise people and make people feel comfortable. It could involve practical things like making sure that people are warm and comfortable and they've got a cup of tea when they come in and that sort of thing. It could involve very literal greetings, making sure you talk to people by their name, actually recognising them. The way in which those sorts of styles of communication oil the wheels of communication. But she also said we need to recognise two styles of communication that tend to be regarded rather negatively. Rhetoric, this sort of passionate expression that where you're trying to persuade people using rhetorical language, tends to be regarded as a bit suspect. No, she says, actually let's recognise the importance of that. And narrative, people tell stories. When people come together to talk about their experiences of using care services, of what it feels like to grow older, what it feels like to become more dependent on family or to try and manage onto a lower budget, people tell stories about what that actually means. Let's recognise the importance of those stories. And let's recognise the place of emotion as well as reason in debates about policies and services. Now, I've developed that idea about the importance of emotion in these contexts, talking about it as what I've referred to as emotional morality. Now, this woman in this picture was caring for her husband with dementia, and she made an impassioned input to a consultation forum that brought together senior public officials and older people. She was reflecting the emotionally charged experiences that she lives with every day. Experiences that encompass pain, fear, loss, and sometimes anger about the way in which she and her husband were treated. And I think whilst it's difficult to encompass emotion in debate, it's really important that emotion is not ruled out of order, that we actually recognise and respect the emotional content of experiences and recognise what that tells us, what we need to learn from that. Okay, I now want to just talk briefly about my first experience of working with a project to involve older people who were substantial users of community-based health and social care services. And this was a project that was developed by Age Concern Scotland in Fife, and it took place in the early 1990s, so a long time ago, still highly relevant, I think. This involved the convening of 7 panels of older people throughout the region of Fife. Those panels met about every 6 weeks, and the process was facilitated by a development officer. Alongside her worked a part-time project worker with support from a secretary. The members of those panels were recruited through local service providers as well as through churches and other local contacts. The project worker was very well networked and used her networks to identify people. 62 people involved in those 7 panels, of whom 35 were aged over 80. The average age was something over 85. So when the local health and social care providers sort of said, of course, these won't really be, you know, the people we recognise as users of our services, we were able to point not only to the age profile, but also the fact that by definition, they were quite intensive users of health services and social care services with a range of health problems. To make this happen, there was a lot of attention required to deal with the practical issues, choosing appropriate venues where people would feel comfortable, ensuring that transport was available to get people there, but virtually by definition, these were people who could not travel to the venue on their own. Sending out reminders to people about meeting dates, ensuring refreshments were always available, making sure notes were kept of discussions and that those notes were circulated to people. So a lot of work in terms of the practical arrangements. The way in which these panels worked was that they started out with quite open discussions. What does it feel like to grow older in Fife? What does it feel like to have to use services? What are the issues that are important to you? So started off with a broad open discussion. Through those discussions, starting to define issues that were important to members of the panels, and then focusing on those issues and saying, well, okay, let's actually come up with some ideas about what sort of changes we might want to see in relation to this issue. Only then inviting service providers to come and meet with the groups and say, okay, we've got a series of questions that we want to put to you about the issues that we've been talking about. Something that many service providers found extremely uncomfortable. The home care manager turned up thinking he was going to give a talk to the panels about home care and the problems of providing home care. He was disabused of that quite quickly and told us, well, actually, we have been discussing home care. We have a series of questions that we want to put to you, so just hold your horses. In some instances, moving beyond the discussions in the panels to get involved in working groups to try and make a change. One issue that was a key issue for the group was about hospital discharge, poor experiences of hospital discharge. The panel actually came up with their 14-point good hospital discharge plan. This is what things would look like if it worked properly. Then get some of them getting involved in a working group involving the hospitals, involving the social work department, involving the ambulance service, and saying, how can we actually make this better? So only when they had, only when the panels themselves had actually developed an identity, developed confidence in talking together, only then were they then prepared to say, well, okay, if the service providers have got some issues they want our input on, we'll talk to them. So what can we learn from that? Thinking about these ideas about deliberative democracy and the critiques of it. Well, I think this experience demonstrates the strength of those critiques I outlined, and also demonstrates how participation practices can be designed to address them. First of all, greeting. Well, certainly the valuing that went on, the recognition of people's input, the expression of greeting through the practical arrangements, as well as the nature of the interaction, I think emphasised the importance of that. People told their stories. They were spaces in which people told their individual stories, but through doing that, actually recognised that those stories were not just individual, that they were shared stories, and that by actually sharing those stories, it was possible to tell a new story, which planted the seeds of change. The new story is how things would look like if it worked properly. And they certainly levelled the playing field. They built strength or courage, as one 90-year-old woman said, it's given me courage. It built courage and strength amongst older people before they actually met with service providers. And creating a safe environment in which people could have their say demonstrated the importance of positive emotional experiences of participating in sustaining their engagement. Now, more recently, I've been working with ideas about something that's called an ethic of care, ideas that have been developed by feminist political philosophers to assert the importance of care as a moral practice in both policy and service delivery. But I've also suggested that the principles that have been outlined in relation to an ethic of care can be applied to processes of participation and can suggest a number of propositions, if you like, about how bringing care into deliberation can enable a positive experience for participants and contribute to making a difference. The 5 principles are attentiveness, being attentive to the needs and circumstances of others, being prepared to take responsibility in responding to your awareness of others' needs, behaving competently. The argument is that if you don't act competently, you cannot give care. The principle of responsiveness, actually being aware of the other in terms of how they are responding to the receipt of care and what that is telling you. And finally, trust, recognising that in most situations in which care is given and received, one person is more powerful than another, and that if care is going to be positive, it needs to recognise that power imbalance, and people need to trust in those unequal power relationships. So what I'm arguing is that we need to deliberate with care as well as about care. And that, as I say, leads to a number of propositions which I think can be used to both guide the design of participation possibilities and to evaluate them. So here are my propositions. Firstly, that dialogue about the experiences deriving from ageing can encourage attentiveness to such experiences and can give recognition to them. That by engaging older people directly in these processes, that direct testimony makes it actually hard to ignore their individual and collective agency. The fact that even though older people may be in need of receiving care, that does not mean they are pathetic, incompetent, that they actually have something to contribute here. Attending to voices that are expressed in unfamiliar ways and which demand a response because of what is being said can actually encourage people to act responsibly to ameliorate the situations being described. That it's actually quite hard to ignore the significance of what people say in these sorts of contexts. And that such attentiveness focuses attention on the consequences of decision making. So it highlights when there is a lack of competence in the way in which services are provided, as well as highlighting the responses of older people to the nature of the care that is being provided. And finally, that public officials' experiences of engaging in dialogue with people who may be upset, who may be fearful, who may be angry, by the way in which they're treated or by their experiences of poor health or increasing disability, whose style of communicating may well be different from what public officials are used to. That can actually enable public officials to confront their own competence in relating to others who may be different from them. It can potentially help official learning. So those are my principles. And in my final few minutes, what I want to do is just talk about a current project that we are involved with. We being my colleagues in my university, working with colleagues in Age Concern in Brighton and working with a group of older people as researchers. This is a project in which we are researching what well-being means to older people. And what we are trying to do is to not only think about the relevance of the principles of care to understanding what well-being means to older people, we are also trying to understand and develop practices of researching with older people that embody those principles of care themselves. So we're researching about care and well-being, and we are trying to research with care with older people. And we have a group currently of 10 older people, ranging in age from late 60s to late 80s. We have a lady who is 87 who lives in sheltered accommodation, whose co-residents can't understand why she keeps popping off to these meetings at the university to do research. So we have a mixed group of older people who we are working with, and we designed a way of working which enabled people to get involved in ways that they felt comfortable with. So some of them are simply meeting with us and discussing and advising. Some of them have been going out and doing interviews. Some of them have been running focus groups. A number of them are currently working with us in the detailed analysis of interview transcripts. And those of you who've had experience of doing qualitative analysis of interview transcripts know what a challenge that is when you're doing it on your own. If you're doing it with 10 people, it's challenging. But as I say, we have tried to work in a way which actually applies care principles to the way in which we work. So that involves us attending to the differences of those people that we're researching with, attending to their support needs, the practical details which make it possible for them to take part in ways that make sense to them. We need to balance our responsibility to get the job done, to make sure that this research project delivers and delivers a high quality project, with our responsibility to act on our attentiveness to the needs of those we are researching with. We need to ensure that we work competently, that we organise ourselves and the project in a competent way in order to meet the aim of involvement. Importantly, we need to be very aware of how the older people that we're working with are responding to the experience of being involved in this project. And in particular, we need to understand the effect that there may be on people who are hearing about some sometimes quite difficult experiences in the interviews that they're doing, who themselves may be facing similar problems or anticipate that they might face similar problems. So to recognise that if somebody, for example, is experiencing their own health problems, their own deteriorating sight, concerns about family actually not providing support, and they're going out and they're interviewing people about those similar sorts of experiences, what does that do to them? So we need to be aware of what impact taking part has on them, and we need to provide support to make sure that that's not damaging. We also need to recognise that although we're working in a participative way with this group of older people, actually it's our project. Yeah, and we have more power over this process than the older people who we're working with. We need to build their trust. We need to create a safe environment. We need to make sure that unequal power doesn't become problematic. Now, only last week we had a meeting with the team where we were, as I say, we're at the analysis stage now, and we were actually reviewing what was said in the interviews about the importance of care to well-being. And the discussion that was going on was not only a very sophisticated discussion in terms of an understanding of the issues, it was also a discussion that dealt with some very painful topics and some very painful issues. And it was just fabulous to see the way in which people were able to really engage with some quite painful and difficult issues and talk very openly about it, which was a sort of justification for the way in which we have been trying to work. So, in conclusion, having a say about care requires careful deliberation. The value of care is often seen to be restricted to the private sphere or to the sphere of the delivery of what are termed care services. An ethic of care perspective encourages us to think about care as something that is also a public virtue and is something that is necessary and important to all of us. It highlights care as a moral practice and something that we should become better at developing in all sorts of different contexts. Rational argument is not enough. I was involved many years ago in evaluating a citizens' jury that took place in Belfast, which brought together people to discuss the development of a new system of health and social care in the north of Ireland. I interviewed a health service manager who took part in that citizens' jury and said, what did you think about the process? What did you feel about it? And she said, well, it was all right. She said, but I thought people were there asking questions because they thought that's what they had to do, rather than because they really cared about or were really concerned about the issues. She said, if I go to a public meeting, I'm faced with people who are often quite angry, who are often wanting to have a go at me, but at least I know that they care about the issues. At least I know that they mean something to them. So in developing opportunities for better argument about public policy issues, we shouldn't actually ignore the significance of the emotional in content of those experiences, because we can actually learn from that. And finally, I'm arguing that enabling people to have a say and care actually requires an ethical approach to those participatory practices, and that that ethical approach can be applied in a range of different contexts in which older people can have a say. Thanks very much.